kind of the biggest issue that we came up against was just sort of a lot of the, inequities that we discovered in the healthcare system, specifically as it pertains to, two men having a child. And, we had some insurance issues with covering her birth. And then also, even just in the hospital, we had, by and large, we had a wonderful experience, but, there was a lot of explaining we had to do. There had to be like a sign on our door just to make sure that, everybody knew we were the parents. I mean, there was just a lot more explanation that had to go into sort of the experience than if it were a heterosexual couple.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your hosts, myself, Tim Bickmore, and my two colleagues, Dan Weiss and Nathaniel Leach. Before we get into we do have a guest today, and I'm going to have Dan introduce our guest. But before we get there, I just want to let everybody know, if you like our content, you like what we're doing, like, share, and subscribe our content to help us out. But with that being said, Dan, I will give you the honors. Please introduce our guest today.
I would be very happy to do that. The guest is a friend of mine, and so we're very excited to have David Clark Sally join us with his new daughter, who is going to be accompanying for maybe at least part of this, maybe all of it. We'll see. It's a baby, right? we never really know. And today we're going to be talking about an experience that David and his husband recently went through, which is the birth of their daughter using a surrogate. So David and Matt are members of the Madison community. They're both professionals here. And so, of course, not just being then working dads, they also have two other daughters that they raise as well. So we know that you have a lot on your hands, David, at all times. And we really appreciate you joining and providing some education on this subject matter.
Of course. Anything for you, Dan. Happy to be here.
We appreciate that.
Well, and David, congratulations on your daughter. She looks beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And so I really just want to get started of talking about how to find a surrogate. And I'm just curious, how do you get started? Can you just tell us about the experience? Let's just start there.
Yeah, of course. And for the listener, if you do hear any erroneous baby noises, that there is a reason. I am holding her currently. My husband is in a meeting, as Dan alluded to. We're both working, so we're trying to make it all happen right now, but hopefully she'll be cooperative. So getting started, I just want to say up top, everybody's journey looks different. You could ask 6 other people who've done this, and they're probably going to have a different variation. So I just want to be explicitly clear that this is just our experience. I don't want to speak for anyone else or any other community. But our journey was challenging. When we really decided that we wanted to do this, this being having a baby, obviously for 2 men, that is not necessarily an easy thing or something that you can just decide. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that you need that we don't have. And so one of those being a uterus. And so I also want to, just as a point of clarification, for the purpose of this particular conversation, it is completely fine to use the word surrogate, but if you want to get granular, and if you want to be more clinically specific, technically we use what's called a gestational carrier, or a GC. A surrogate is someone who carries the child, and it's also partly their DNA, so their egg and their uterus. We use a gestational carrier who it was only, and I say only not to downplay it, but it was just her uterus. We used a donor egg. So technically she was a gestational carrier for us. Not a huge deal. It's, people interchange the words all the time, but just for clinical purposes, she was technically a GC for us. So where do you start? There's a lot of really incredible organizations, agencies that exist with the specific purpose of helping people like us match with surrogates, as well as with donor eggs, donor sperm, all of the above, right? There's agencies that you can work with that will match you. We did kind of start down that path with an agency. We thought it was going to work out with some people that we knew. We had a lot of speed bumps along the way, a lot of things that didn't work out, a lot of disappointments early on. And some of those disappointments were costly. And so we got to a point where ultimately, as much as we would have loved the help and support of an agency, we were looking to cut costs wherever we could in the process. And so we opted to attempt to match with a gestational carrier independently. It is probably one of the more riskier things that you could do, obviously, because you don't have the backing and the support of an agency who is essentially going to cover you. They're going to be doing all of the the work for you, but essentially you're also paying them a significant amount of money too, right? Of course, for their services. And so we thought, not that we know better by any stretch of the imagination, but, we could maybe try to do this on our own and maybe save some money. And I will say we got exceptionally lucky. Spoiler alert, because we do have a healthy baby. But again, I know that is certainly, I consider us to just be exceptionally lucky the way that it worked out. And for just even additional logistics, we ended up, so we matched independently, and we used a Facebook group. Actually, there are a ton of them out there. They're closed groups. Generally, the way that we discovered them, that they're regionally based, and so we joined a few regional groups around us, and it kind of works a little bit like a dating profile, in the sense that you sort of put out there who you are and what you're looking for. Gestational carriers can do the same, and then if you're interested in having a conversation, you can kind of take that to DMs. And so it's risky, these people could be trying to scam you. You're literally looking at the possibility of working with someone to entrust with them potentially the most important thing. Now, of course, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I will say, just as the caveat, there always is in this process lots of legal. So you do get to a point, if you're having a conversation with someone, where it does have to become legitimized. And at a certain point in time, I would assume you could weed out anybody who's trying to scam you. But yeah, so we spent quite a while conversing with a bunch of different amazing women, and kind of honestly relatively quickly found the person who ended up caring for us. And she it was one of those things where, again, it's luck, it's sort of happenstance, but we had a good feeling about her from the beginning. We talked to some other people, and then we ended up going back with our first gut. So
David, a question I've never asked you, I don't think. So when you guys were starting the process of Ellie, so when you started that process, how did you involve the other children?
Yeah, no, we actually made a point not to. For us, as I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of false starts in terms of, thinking something was going to work out and then it didn't, and thinking, and so that for us was incredibly emotionally and mentally draining as adults. And so we kind of made the decision up front that we weren't going to involve them until there was a confirmed and a pregnancy, just because it felt like, so our older girls are 11 and 9, and it just felt like that was a lot to ask of them emotionally, to kind of also experience that. If it was that hard for us, I don't know that it would have been fair to ask them to go through that too. So we actually kept them out of the process until we had a confirmed pregnancy, and then we even waited a little longer just to make sure that it was a viable pregnancy.
So David, kind of leads me into my second question, and just out of curiosity, listen to you speak, which is crazy that Facebook, creates. They never would have thought, but it makes also a ton of sense.
Yeah.
I'm just curious on like supply and demand. I know that's kind of the way where my brain goes. So with GCs, or is there a lot of are there a lot of people that are willing to provide this? And then how did you find the egg specifically? And was that like, could you just give a little bit more detail around like, was there a lot of people out there saying like, yes, I'm willing to do this? Do they have say then in like what egg is going to be used, or is that completely just up to you and your husband? Like, just out of curiosity, how do you find that right combination, or is that really kind of luck of the draw, as you kind of mentioned?
I mean, you do have to, a lot to unpack there. You do need to find somebody whose values align with yours, because ultimately it is her body, right? And so, there's a lot of legal documentation that you ultimately have to sign. I'm talking, very, very thick. And you have to kind of be on the same page in terms of, how would you handle this situation? How would you handle this situation? Because again, at the end of the day, it's her body. Yes, it's your child, and the documentation covers that, but it also explicitly states that, her body, her choice. So, you do kind of have to be on the same page with whomever you choose to work with, that, if X happened, we agree this is how it would be handled. And so those are conversations you would want to have before. And we actually got really fortunate in that our G had done this several times before, twice before actually. So she was kind of a pro. So she already knew kind of how all this was going to go, and was able to even give us an education before we even started to say, oh, this is probably going to come up. Sorry. She was able to say, I think this is probably going to come up, or this is the thing we need to talk about, or you might want to consider this. And so, that actually really helped too. We had somebody who had experience. But then when you ask about the egg, again, there's so many options, but we did actually use an agency to find our egg donor. And that process, again, it's so overwhelming. It's so overwhelming because you have so many things to sort of choose from and pick from. And they give you profiles to sort of wade through, and you have to kind of determine what you're looking for. And it's kind of, you're looking at their health, you're looking at their history, you're looking at eye color, you're looking at, kind of basically down to, every scratch they might have had, what kind of music they like. I mean, lots of different things in these profiles. And typically speaking, if you're doing egg and carrier separately, the carrier is not, for our experience and from what we, a lot of people we've spoken to, is not going to have an active part in choosing that. That's really, up to the IPs, intended parents. That's another term. So in that case, we had embryos made. And then, that was not anything that our GC was involved in, was that process. Now you asked about supply and demand, and I'm sorry, I'm all over the place, but I'm trying to touch on everything that you asked. I do know for a fact, that there is a surrogate shortage, all over the place right now. We're in so many Facebook groups. We know people who work at agencies, and there's just a massive shortage. There is zero shortage of IPs, people wanting to do this for a myriad of reasons, and not enough women who are able, or who maybe even know about it. I think that's the other thing is, maybe there are people who are interested, but the qualifications in order to do it, it is there, and perhaps rightfully so. It's not really mine to decide, but there's a lot of boxes you have to check in order to even be a candidate. It's not just like anyone who has a uterus is able to do it. And so, even, folks who might be interested, if they don't check all the boxes, that's not an option. So I do know that in terms of supply and demand with specific to surrogates, where we are right now is that there is a significant shortage.
Audience, we took a brief break there so that Ellie could enjoy her swing, and we were just talking about how we wish those existed for adults too. But question, follow up to Tim's question, David. So out of curiosity, when you and Matt were selecting the attributes pertaining to the donor of this egg, were there conversations that came up that you just weren't anticipating, surprised you, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's so interesting, and the process for me anyways felt a little strange, because you're sort of, thumbing through this digital directory of profiles, and you really are, in a sense, sort of objectifying these people by their attributes, right? Because you have no other information, which is just kind of the way it goes, but it feels kind of weird. And so absolutely, we had conversations. I don't think we went into it knowing what we were looking for specifically. I think we just thought, we'll know when we see it. But you end up having conversations like, well, what color hair do we want, or what, how tall do we want this person to be, knowing that it's only half the DNA, but still, you start to really consider sort of very interesting things. And then, you think about, well, it's interesting that they put this on the profile, that she enjoys, this kind of music. Is that something that we should be thinking about? Like, there's a reason it's there, but why, so yes, you do start to, like, I think, really get down in the weeds and second guess yourself. And what's also hard, sometimes you pick out somebody that you spend hours agonizing over, and then by the time you sort of like get through the process, you find out, oh, maybe they aren't available. And so then you got to go back to the drawing board. So yeah, I mean, it does kind of mess with your head a little bit. Very little, but at the same time, a lot. So it's kind of messes with your brain.
What was height a factor? Because Matt's what, 6'7", 6'8"?
Yeah, my husband is 6'7", so we did opt for someone who was a little on the taller side, knowing that her sisters would be pretty tall, and thought that would be, at least she wouldn't stand out in a bad way. Maybe when you lined everybody up, she would have a little height, hopefully.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know just from our conversations that your GC is not from Wisconsin.
Correct.
And so again, that goes, I guess, to the supply and demand and the whole process as well, too, which
100%.
we'll talk more about some things that have come up because of that. But, and I also know too, which this is just, I mean, you couldn't have it more perfect, that she remains in your family's life and has become a good friend, which is, I mean, just fantastic.
Absolutely.
Once you kind of got to that point, during the pregnancy, like, what was yours and Matt's involvement? What were the involvement of the girls? Like, how did you, obviously you had roughly 9 months. What was that period of time like?
Yeah. I mean, so COVID, was a factor in that. Obviously, there was a lot less we could do because of, who they were allowing in doctors' rooms and things. Another factor that made it difficult was, as you mentioned, she was not from Wisconsin. She lives about 4 hours away, which isn't horrible, but difficult to get to appointments easily. So we were as involved as we could be. We FaceTimed into almost every appointment. So we got to see, first ultrasounds and hear first heartbeats and things via video. We got to be on video during our transfer, which is when they put the embryo in our GC. So we actually got to watch that process on video live as it was happening, which was very anticlimactic, but also very exciting. And so we were as involved as we could be in all of those sorts of things. And then we had a group text with our carrier, and the three, I mean, we talked constantly. She would send videos of, oh, my belly is doing this, or, progress pictures. And, we talked regularly. And then, once it started to be a little more real, and then our older girls knew, of course, then there's all the preparation at home that they got to help with, and baby showers. And we did go for the big 20-week ultrasound, which is typically when you find out, whether you're having a boy or a girl. We already knew because of science, and they can tell those things much earlier. But we were able to go to like one of the big appointments, and then thankfully, when she was born in October, things had settled down with COVID a little bit at that point. That was before the most recent surge again, obviously. And so we were actually able to go and be in the room for her birth and stay in the hospital. So, I mean, we felt super involved. And I think part of that was we, again, got really lucky and found somebody who shared our values and who wanted to keep us in the loop as much as we wanted to be. And we were like, yes, we want to know all the things. And so it was kind of perfect in that regard.
So, David, were there any complications that arose within, not only during the pregnancy timeframe, but like anywhere else within the process that maybe you could speak to and maybe give us some detail on?
Yeah, of course. I alluded to earlier, I won't get into necessarily specifics for the sake of these people, but I alluded to earlier, we had some false starts with regards to, before we found our GC with other folks that, we thought would work out, or that we sort of went down the process or started going through the process with, and then it didn't work out, or fell through for various reasons at various points. So I think out of the gate, those were some complications and some heartbreak to work through, thinking that, this was going to happen this way with this person, and then it didn't. And so when we finally landed where we landed with our gestational carrier, I think we were to be frank, we were just really kind of burnt out. And I think, at least for me, I was a little jaded. I was like, I'm not convinced this is going to work. Pause. What are you doing? Here. Just sleep. I know you want to. Can I just pick up there? Is that okay? Do you need to re-ask the question? Okay. To be frank, I was just, a little jaded and not really convinced that it was going to work. I think that was part of it, was me just sort of protecting myself too, because we had some significant setbacks. I will say, when we did get pregnant, we actually got pregnant the first try. So the first transfer they did, it's not guaranteed to take, right? They transfer the healthiest embryo, but it doesn't mean anything. Obviously, all the conditions have to be right. But we were really fortunate. Our first transfer took. And so we got pregnant on the first try, and we had a really, really uncomplicated pregnancy, really healthy, no issues. I will say, kind of the biggest issue that we came up against was just sort of a lot of the, inequities that we discovered in the healthcare system, specifically as it pertains to, two men having a child. And I think that became very clear in a myriad of ways, specifically with, we had some insurance issues with covering her birth. And then also, even just in the hospital, we had, by and large, we had a wonderful experience, but, there was a lot of explaining we had to do. There had to be like a sign on our door just to make sure that, everybody knew we were the parents. I mean, there was just a lot more explanation that had to go into sort of the experience than if it were a heterosexual couple. And so, you kind of look at, and granted, look, we have a healthy baby and we're very grateful, but, it didn't always feel equitable. It sometimes felt like, we're having to jump through extra hoops. We had so much paperwork to go through and sign, which I know everybody does, but a lot of it was because someone else was carrying our baby. So
building off that a bit, David. So I think you are being very articulate, especially when you use the term equitable. That's probably as nice as you can put that situation, because it is a very difficult component to this, that I know that you and Matt just did not expect a lot of that part of the experience, and it became in some ways overshadowing for at least part of that time frame. I mean, it's insulting, right? And so that's hard. I mean, if you're comfortable, can you talk a little bit about maybe what the feeling behind that was, what it did to the experience, how you kind of got over that, and maybe even the aftermath? Because I know too that, I mean, that meant, right? That meant, and we'll talk about some of the financial components in a second, that meant a lot of uncertainty about what this cost was going to bring you that you weren't expecting. And I know it took a lot of actions to try to get that covered, which ultimately you did get some help, but it's unfortunate you had to go through the ways you did. Could you expand a little bit about what that process was like?
Yeah, of course. So just to clarify, so, going back to what I had said, we did run into a pretty significant roadblock that we were not expecting. Some of these things you kind of do expect, or people tell you, this might happen or whatnot, or you kind of think, this might be more challenging. But this was one we did not see coming. But ultimately, our insurance company was denying coverage of her birth because it was going to be taking place out of network in where our GC lives, which is, like I said, about 4 hours away. Even though she is legally, even part biologically, our child going to be on our insurance here, going to be, all of the things, right? We could even prove all those things. And yet they deemed that it was not medically necessary for her to be born there. There were insinuations made that, essentially, you could have found a carrier that lives closer. Your carrier could come here, was a suggestion they get, when the baby's born. Just not practical things, really. Quite frankly, we wanted our carrier, who we have become friendly with, and who's giving us this amazing gift, to be able to be where she's comfortable, right? Not to mention the fact, anybody who's been pregnant knows that you're not advised to travel towards the end of the pregnancy. So for an insurance company to suggest that we bring her here for the birth was also just asinine. But all that to say is, Dan, you know this firsthand as a friend who was kind of walking alongside me during all of this. But you suggested this, and I think this rings true. It did, unfortunately, it distracted from a lot of our joy during some of those months where we were fighting for what we thought was right. We were fighting for what we thought was fair, and it was not easy. And so we ultimately ended up, we really didn't intend for this, but we had an opportunity placed in our lap to get some attention on this with a local news story. And so we said, okay, I guess let's do it. Let's give it a go. And it got a lot of attention. And I think ultimately that was what turned things around, where the insurance company agreed to cover the birth, but certainly not a fight that we saw coming, nor the one that we wanted to have, nor one that we should have had to have. It felt very unfair. It was very unfair, and to your point, Dan, it did distract from what should have been, and what was ultimately a very joyful time, but it added a lot of unnecessary stress, for sure.
So speaking to these difficulties, as well as just the general pregnancy experience, can you also speak a little bit about the costs involved
Yeah, of course. And I mean, again, I'll reiterate, this was our experience. We had, you know, there's so many things that you can do to either increase or decrease the cost depending upon how you want to do this. You have, a donor egg cost, if you need that, or you might have a sperm cost, if donor sperm, if you need that. And then, in our case, there's also the cost of, the carrier. So those are all sort of individual costs. But then before, even you need the carrier, you have costs that you pay to fertility clinic to create embryos. Then you have embryo testing. Then you have embryo transfer. Each one of those things costs. Then you have all of the testing that comes after that. They test, essentially check those embryos regularly in the very beginning to make sure everything's progressing. And then, so all of those things cost. Fortunately, a lot of clinics are similar to this, but we work with a clinic where it's kind of like you pay for essentially what is a package. You sort of agree to, these are the items that we're going to need, and this is what we're going to pay for them. And it's sort of a known cost starting out, which is helpful to budget for that when you know it. But when it's all said and done, I mean, for us with all the pieces, I mean, it was certainly very close to, and even a little bit past, a six-figure process. Again, it kind of depends on what you need. Again, we were able to cut costs. Honestly, ours was a pretty modest journey in comparison to a lot of folks who we know who have done this, especially other gay dads. We were able to cut costs. We didn't work with an agency, like I said, to find our GC, so we cut some costs there. Our GC was willing to work with us on a lot of the specifics of the contract, things that would be in a traditional contract that she just didn't want or need, and was willing to kind of work with us on, that maybe others might not have been. So I mean, we had a lot of areas like that where we got some relief. We applied for a ton of grants, which the irony in is every grant you apply for, you have to pay to apply for it. So we lost money there, but we did end up getting a grant. So that was a little bit of relief there. We got a grant. So there were areas in which we got some relief. So I would say, if you think that sounds like a lot, and I certainly do, I don't, it actually could be a lot worse. All that to say. And especially with the insurance fight, had we not ultimately won that fight, that would have been more money on that top of that. And that specifically with that piece was just what we hadn't budgeted for that. We had a very specific plan and budget, and that we had wiggle room for unexpected things, but that was not a part of that. We didn't anticipate that. So that would have been a hard pill to swallow financially, but also just, on principle, right? That would have been an unfortunate thing to have to sort of deal with. So.
As we embark on closing thoughts, I actually don't have a comment or a quote to make, as I typically would do, but instead a praise and an ask. So I don't think I've done that before. So the praise. First, I just want to thank all of the people that do make these very giving gifts to be donors, to help support other people that really need some help in having this part of their life. Second, related to that is the ask, which is, David mentioned that there is a supply and demand issue in this case, and this is a big ask because obviously this undertaking is huge for anybody involved. But I think that there could be more support in the direction of people that want to participate on different ends of this process. And so if it's something that you yourself are thinking about providing support, whether it's being a GC, a surrogate, a donor, or just supporting a friend going through this, I just would personally ask that you please seek out how you can best do that, because there clearly is a need to do so.
Absolutely. I would echo that. And, even if it's something that, you've just had a thought about before or are thinking about for the first time because of this podcast or whatever the case may be, there really is no harm in asking the questions and doing the research, right? And finding out if you might be a good fit. We have several, if you're listening to this locally and you live in Madison, we have several really wonderful agencies that I know would be glad to entertain your questions because they're hurting just as much as the families who are waiting for their moment. So,
Nathaniel, any final thoughts?
It must have taken a lot of discipline and commitment to continue on this, despite all of the roller coaster of emotions that you felt. I know from personal experience everybody has something in their life where they go through some sort of emotional roller coaster. And it's during those times that you really determine, you really learn more about yourself, and to see you commit like that takes a lot. So.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, to that point, I think you also really, in a greater sense, when there's adversity like that in your path, it really also helps just even more clearly bring into focus like what it is that you really want. And I think for us, when we finally got to this point that we're at now, it just was all that sweeter, as difficult as it was. So.
Yeah, and for my final thoughts, I think I'm going to tie this back into our title, which is Critical Thinking Required. And I think another way to say that is a different perspective. And I think, David, I appreciate you and your husband willingness to bring your daughter on here, and also your story, because it's a story that needs to be heard. It's a story that it needs to be heard. It needs to be understood, because in all reality, you're in the minority, and that minority voice needs to be heard because this does happen. This is real. There are inequities that go behind the scenes that people just may not be aware of. They may just see the result, which is a beautiful baby, but a lot to get there through that determination, that emotional roller coaster is something that helps change maybe others' perspectives on the scenario and their situation, or maybe their own. It makes me a little bit grateful that I wouldn't have to go through potentially those types of difficulties, just given my own personal situation, which also makes me lean back to Dan's following thoughts, which to support and ask for support, because people in that situation may need that type of support. So I just appreciate you coming on here and telling that story, because I think it hits very well on our title, which is to think differently about having a child, because everybody's situation is different, and it's not always the easiest, and it's not always the most smooth, and hopefully at the end it's always a healthy baby, healthy GC or mother or whoever it may be, and it looks like that did happen for you and Matt, and it's really wonderful that you brought her on. So thank you, really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having, and I appreciate all of you too as well. Inviting this conversation into this space, but also, being cognizant and sensitive of language too. I think Dan and I have talked about this many times in our chats of just, how ignorant people can be and things that they say that they don't maybe intend to be, but in this process, and we've certainly gotten some doozies along the way. And I appreciate, your intention with language and being, very cognizant of what you're saying and how you're saying it. Not that we can't all learn, and that's great too, but it's nice to be invited into a space where you feel like people have actually, done the homework and are listening. That feels nice. So thank you all for that.
Absolutely, David. Any other final thoughts you want to leave our guests, David, before we close out on the podcast today?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think Dan, you sort of left us with a great challenge, which I think is that think about, this and how this fits into may or may not fit into your life. If it doesn't, think about how you could support someone who is going through that. I'm telling you what, there were plenty of people who had no desire or could not be, a surrogate for us, but, could and did, give us their hand-me-downs or brought us a meal, or, I'm telling you, I know that sounds maybe cheesy, but, just because you can't, or don't want to, carry a child doesn't mean that you can't help us, as we go through this process, or whomever that, right? Sorry, I didn't mean that about us specifically. But don't just, think about ways that you can support the people in your life who are going through it. Don't just assume that, just because you can't or don't want to do some of those other bigger things, that you can't do other smaller things, because it really does. It takes a village, and all of the support is needed and appreciated. So
thank you again, David, for joining us.
Yeah.
We know that this information is going to be valuable to many, and so we appreciate you sharing your story. It's a very personal story, so thank you again for being on here and taking the time with us to do so. And thank you to our audience for always tuning in hopes to be lifelong learners like ourselves. We appreciate your attendance and your commitment to the podcast. So everybody have a great day, and a big thank you from all of us.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time.